Welcome back, Ty and That Guy. I'm Wes Chatham, and this is my good friend, Ty Franck. Say hello, Ty.
Hello, Ty.
Today, we're going to do an episode. We're going to try something a little bit different. We have not done a current show and where we talk about it week to week, like scuttlebutt, like hanging out by the water cooler and having a conversation, which is a thing that I love and I miss about the old days when you wouldn't just binge shows. You would watch a show and then you would talk about it all week with your friends. But I don't think that we've really cared enough about a show up until now to do a week-to-week discussion. And the show that we are going to discuss is a show called The Last of Us. Ty is a big gamer, and Ty, I just want to, start off and talking a little bit about the game and what your thoughts are. I've never played the game, Last of Us, but do you remember the first time or when you heard about it and how you got involved in the game and what your thoughts were?
I mean, when it first came out, this was back in, I believe the PlayStation 4 days is when I first played it. But when it first came out, or maybe even the PS3, it might even been the PS3, man, a while ago. It had a lot of hype. It already had a lot of hype when the game was coming out. The early trailers for it had been very good. It was one of those games that made a splash right out of the gate. And I remember buying it this is how old it is. I went to fucking GameStop and bought it on a physical disc and played through the opening sequence. There's kind of a little prologue that you play through.
Do you remember what year this is?
I don't remember. I don't remember what year it was.
2013, probably.
Yeah, it actually 2013, and it was the PS3.
Yeah. Okay, so it was PS3. Yeah, and playing through that little prologue, and I got done with it. I was like, this might be the most cinematic video game I've ever played, and it had real emotion to it. It had like there's a gut punch at the end of this little, I don't know, hour long prologue that you play. That really, it hit me. I play video games all the time, and most of the time the supposed emotional payoff in the game kind of just bounces off of me, but this actually worked. And I remember as I was playing through it thinking, this is like playing a movie or a TV show. The story is that good. That, as you're playing through it, you're like, this is a fucking great story. And wondering if anybody was planning to do a tie-in novel or any of that kind of stuff based on it. So, I guess it was a year and a half ago, I saw in the trades that somebody was developing Last of Us as a TV show. It was so obvious. It's obviously they're making it a TV show. It already was a TV show. The game is a TV show. And when I saw it was HBO doing it, and especially Craig Mazin, I was like, this is going to be fucking great. Because he also made probably my favorite thing that has ever been on HBO. So I was like, when you take that talent and you combine it with that property, something great is going to come out of that.
I remember you and I having a conversation one time and you were telling me what you love about games, and you said that your love of games is really just your love of story, and it's just another expression of story. And so Last of Us was like a heavyweight story on top, weaved into a video game. Did it change the way video games were made from going forward? Did they all become more cinematic?
Not really. I mean, video games have been becoming more cinematic anyway, just because the graphics power is getting better and better. And so you can really graphically make a cinematic moment in a way that older games couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's already true. But what Last of Us did that was so unusual, and I'm not saying they're the only game that's ever done this. Other games have done this too. So I'm not trying to say that. But what Last of Us did is it was very much a story first kind of game. That the most important thing about Last of Us was the story you were inhabiting. And there's upsides and downsides to that. The downside to it is that player agency tends to be low. In a lot of, people always talk about sandbox games. It's a sandbox game. You could do anything you want. You could play any kind of game you want in this thing. I tend to get bored very quickly with those games. Other people love them. Other people love that kind
Grand
of game.
Theft Auto,
But yeah, that kind of game where it's they give you a world, they give you a set of rules to that world and the kind of character you can play, and then you just do whatever you want. You just run around and do whatever. And those games always also have a story, but if you ignore that story, you totally can. The game doesn't care if you just ignore the story. I tend to get bored very quickly with those games because when the game tells me that nothing is important, then I stop caring about the game. Then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is very, very, very heavily narrative games, which gamers will call games that are on rails, where you're playing through it, you're inhabiting the character, but most of the important decisions have already been made for you. You know, that the important decisions happen in cutscenes where you have no control over the character.
Mm-hmm.
Last of Us definitely is very far into the narrative-driven type story. Mm. The thing that makes it work, the thing that makes you care about it, even though most of the important decisions in the game are not decisions that you are making, is the story itself is so good that you don't care. You just want to go along. You just want to be there. You want to see what's going to happen next. You want to inhabit those characters. And then the parts that are gameplay are interesting enough that it keeps you interested gameplay-wise as well. It was an unusual combination of things that were both done extremely well. And almost everybody I know who played Last of Us loved it. Loved the shit out of it.
Did you love the shit out of it?
Oh, yeah. I played through the game 3 times, in spite of the fact that all 3 playthroughs were basically exactly the same because you can't really change anything that happens in the larger story. I didn't care. I just loved the game. I loved playing through it.
Now, was the opening to the video game very similar to the opening of the movie? Was it as was the video game as fleshed out as the show was?
Yes, with one big difference. So they added a scene at the very beginning of the first episode where there's these scientists in 1968 on a talk show talking about the dangers of mold as an infection. Yeah, that's the only scene that they added.
Yeah.
The way the show starts with it, you know, Joel going to work and his daughter Ellie giving him the watch as a present, and you know the character of his brother, and everything going to shit, and what tragically happens to Ellie at the end of that little prologue thing. That's all straight from the game, like straight from the game.
Wow, how fleshed out. I mean, so before you start playing, you watch the whole story play out, or can you like skip it if you want to get to the action?
You can, but I don't know anybody that does.
Yeah, I mean, you got it.
Because it's so good.
You know, you talk about the 1968, you talk about the talk show, when they talk about that fungus. I think Craig Mazin said the reason that they had that is really to kind of, he was interested in the idea of like, these pandemics are there. It's just the right conditions. And like now everybody's more sophisticated in their understanding of pandemics. And so we wanted to give a little information about that. But those cordyceps. So have you ever heard of a man called Paul Stamets?
The name is really familiar, but I don't know why.
So I like the mushrooms, right?
I know. On this podcast, you have talked about almost going to prison in Puerto Rico.
Right. Costa Rica. But I am so I'm a fan. Well, I read this book of called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. And in the book, he talks about this man named Paul Stamets. So then you get curious about this guy, Paul Stamets. And this guy is a man, a brilliant man who's dedicated his life to the study of mushrooms and fungi. And things that he has discovered and the way that he talks about mushrooms, it blows my fucking mind. And he tells the story. This is how he fell in love with mushrooms. He tells the story that when he was growing up, he had a bad stammer. He wasn't able to finish a full sentence, especially when he was talking to a girl. And it really bothered him. And he was in college. And when he was in college, he bought for the first time a bag of mushrooms. And he was by himself. And he didn't know how much to take or whatever. So he ended up taking a heroic dose. He ended up he ate the bag of mushrooms, right?
Wow.
And he said, I ate all of these mushrooms by myself, and there was a thunderstorm on the horizon. So I climbed to the top of a tree. Like I completely lost all faculties of reasoning in the sense
so
of
he decided he wanted to risk getting hit by lightning.
Yeah, like he wasn't thinking.
Yeah.
His thought was, everything is so beautiful right now that I want to get a closer look at the storm. So he climbed to the top of this tree during this massive thunderstorm, and he watched the thunderstorm from the top of a tree. And he said it changed my life. It changed the way I saw the world. It changed everything. Next day at school, he's walking to class, and this girl comes up to him, and this is a girl that he found particularly attractive. And that he started talking to her, and he realized halfway through the conversation that his stammer was completely gone.
Wow.
and it never returned. And it did something to his synapses, something to his brain. And so then he became obsessed with mushrooms. Well, in his books or reading about his story is where I heard about these ants and the fungus and the cordyceps and the ants. And I remember there was like a BBC nature show like a long time ago that fucking terrified me.
Yeah,
because
it is terrifying.
It was like, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And they would get infected with this fungi. The fungi would control the ant's mind.
Yep.
And make them crawl up to the top of trees. And then and it showed on the video the ants like they're walking like
they're zombies.
Like zombies.
Yeah, they're zombies.
And their eyes are clouding over and everything. And they go to the top of the trees and then they explode out of their heads. And the spores then infect other ants.
Yep.
And they all kind of do the same thing. And there's like hundreds of other insect species that are affected by different cordyceps.
Yep.
And what's interesting is like because wherever this, I don't know exactly where this was, but ants were like out of control. And so it's like nature's way of like calming things down, right? Like, so when there was other like highly successful insects that were getting to be much, then they would have their own specific cordyceps because these cordyceps specialized in one insect. So it'd be like a cricket one or a butterfly one. It wouldn't be the ant one. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, like that is a fucking horror movie. And what's crazy is these ants, when they identified that there was an affected ant, they would grab that affected ant and haul ass away from the other ants and like discard.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't affect the other ants. So I'm like, that's their own zombie movie.
Yeah.
Right there. Like
the ants are living through a zombie apocalypse.
And it's fucking spooky and it's fascinating. But the fungi, like he talks about, that the intelligence of fungi, that when they build subways and stuff like that, they study the way that fungi like move around certain obstacles and how they, and the biggest living organism on earth is fungi. So it's just fascinating. So that opening scene with this thing that I'm already terrified about, because of course, when you watch that as a kid and you're like, why the fuck what's stopping them from doing that to human beings?
And it's just body temperature.
And it's just body temperature.
Yep.
And, one of the things that, like, one of the theories is that when you eat those magic mushrooms and the psilocybin, the shrooms are letting you see the world as it is. Like, as the shrooms and the fungi see the world, you're seeing the world as that. And so, but what if it's just like all things where they just want to control your brain in some ways? So like I'm living my life now for mushrooms, but I have no idea that I am. So it's pretty fascinating. So I thought that was a great setup, and I love the retro and the 60s and everything like that.
I felt like because I've heard other opinions, like other people played the game, like why did they add that scene? We didn't need that, whatever. I actually felt like it was a good addition. I agree, if you played the game, you don't need that scene. But I think there's a lot of people, obviously, HBO wants this show to be watched by a lot of people who haven't played the game. And I think the scene does a nice job of saying, this crazy thing that's about to happen is not that far off from a real thing that could happen. Like, it's just placing, because things are about to go nuts, things are about to go crazy. And they're saying, look, this isn't that far off from what really could happen. It's putting the horror right next to you. And I think that was a smart move. I think placing it in the space like that was a smart writing move. And it doesn't surprise me because this is the guy who wrote Chernobyl. Mm-hmm. My favorite thing that has ever been on HBO is Chernobyl.
Right. So
the way that he was able to make the Chernobyl disaster understandable, because for me, Chernobyl's a horror movie. And the way he's like, look, this is going to feel like a horror movie. This shit is fucking real. And it gives you all of the little details that you need so that when the horrific things, the unbelievable things happen, you go, oh my God, that really happened. That's a real thing that can happen. Yeah. And it was so cleverly done in Chernobyl that when I knew he was the one who was doing Last of Us, I was like, I felt very safe. I felt like I was in safe hands.
Right.
And that opening scene, it felt like him just saying, I'm just going to give you just enough detail that you understand that this horror is real. And now we're going to go, now we're going to go watch the horror. Yeah, I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, I mean, anything that sets up mystery and suspense, because the scene within itself has an arc that's interesting within itself. I think the danger of doing something like that is if you're just giving information.
Yeah.
Right? But to see the arc of the audience and the host go through of holy shit, you know, like it totally shot to their soul, and the fear that they had within it makes you realize, and it's fucking true and it's real, and that's what kind of what resonated with me. But Craig Mazin
I'm surprised you liked it, because wouldn't you have preferred that it just be a text crawl at the beginning?
Yeah, why couldn't they they could have done that in 1968. Yeah, they could have done that in a text scroll. They could have done the whole prologue in a text scroll. But Craig Mazin has like one of my favorite podcasts. Him and a guy named John August, they have this podcast called Script Notes. And I think that they are so, you know, it's a podcast for screenwriters and people that are interested in everything that screenwriters are interested in. So everybody, you know, listens to it, but it's like specifically about story and screenwriting and things like that. But when they're so smart when they talk about story and they discuss story. And Craig, one of my favorite episodes of the Script Notes podcast, and by the way, like that's why, like, you know, I was so looking forward to Chernobyl or certain shows, because I'm a big fan of them, Craig Mazin and John August.
Oh, did they have the podcast before Chernobyl?
Oh, they had the podcast. I mean, I think that podcast has been around over 10 years.
Oh my God, I did not know that. I need to check this out.
Oh, the podcast has been around forever. I mean, this podcast was around like when Craig Mazin was doing comedies, like when he was doing Hangover, shit like that. And he continued even through you know, Chernobyl. Like they continue to do it. It's a thing that they do. But one of my favorite episodes is because every now and then they'll like break down movies, and they did a Die Hard episode, which I highly recommend. But one of the ones is he did Finding Nemo, and he kind of and they'll go through and break down from a story perspective, from a writer's perspective of why this thing works. But one of the things he talks about is that, you know, like he says, you know, people talk about Save the Cat, or they talk about these, you know, books where they have screenplay structure. He says, but the thing that all these stories miss is the why. Why? Okay, so you do this here, but why is he doing this there? What is this at? And really, to truly motivate a character, when you create a character, the obstacles are tailor-made to hit the weakest point within the character that you created. So like in Finding Nemo, you start off with his father gets his whole family wiped out. And not only is his whole family wiped out, he has one surviving son. And that surviving son has a little fin. So not only is his whole family wiped out, there's this little fin. So there's a guy that's already has like a bit of insecurity and a bit of sense of safety. And then you have this. And so now you have a true understanding of what's motivating him and why he's behaving. And that sparks like the cause and effect, the behavior of him throughout the whole thing of what he's trying to protect and what he's trying to do. And then what ultimately is his journey and how he lets go at the end. And that's what the movie's about, or what the movie's trying to say. Anyway, all that is to say that this prologue really fits into what he's talking about, because, you know, you see, like I truly felt, you know, as a father, you know, with kids and, you know, obviously you talk about writing all the father, you know, kids relationships, parents relationships in The Expanse, but his relationship to like their relationship to his daughter and what happens to her. I don't know if like, obviously spoiler alerts, but what happens to her in the prologue fucking broke my heart, dude.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know anything about the game. I didn't know anything, and I really just loved, what was the actress's name? I thought she did such a great job. She was so adorable.
Oh, the one who plays the daughter? Yeah, she was really good. Yeah.
Nico Parker. And I just really enjoyed her. And I enjoyed the whole like world coming apart. I think one of the greatest zombie opening movie scenes ever is like in Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead. When
I agree.
That gets me every time.
When they wake up in bed and the little girl's standing in the hallway.
Yeah. Oh my God.
So like Zack Snyder gets a lot of shit, and some of it is very justified. But the guy knows how to frame a shot. The guy knows how to shoot a scene. That thing with her waking up and looking down the hallway and the little girl's standing there with blood on her face. The characters do exactly what you or I would do, what anyone would do in that circumstance. Like, are you okay, honey? Like, that's what you would do, right? You'd be like, oh my God, there's this little girl, she's hurt. I should call
But
an
they don't
ambulance.
see her hurt at first. They see her in the shadows. And see, the thing is like one of the things that my parents, they always talk about, one of the things that my kids does is at nighttime, he wakes up in the middle of the night and he comes and stands over my bed and just watches, because he's scared or whatever, and he watches me. I don't know if he's like hesitant to wake me up. And I'll sense somebody there, and I wake up out of the sleep, and I just see this figure just staring at me. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, what do you want? Like, it's like I almost don't trust him. So it is like that scene when he wakes. So, you know, what I love is how it's set up, right? It's like the mundane house, and the alarm clock goes off, and he's cuddled up with his wife. Yep. And we know in horror movies, like, you know, we get a little bit of a relaxation time before the shit goes down. And then his daughter comes up, and you see her silhouette in the door. And he's like, what? And he wakes up. He's like, what's wrong, baby? What's going on? And then she walks into the room. She's like, she has no lips.
It's not their kid. It's like the neighbor kid.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, in the Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, it's not their kid. It's like the neighbor kid is in their house, and they're like, are you okay? Like, because it's so weird that like the neighbor's daughter is standing in their hallway.
I thought it was their kid.
No, it's not their kid there. Yeah. So it's just it's that weird moment of like, are you okay? And then she's got like blood on her face, so it's like, are you hurt? Do you need help? Yeah, and then when she just starts running at him,
and then she just runs and attacks him. Yeah. And then when she, you know, then the wife comes and throws him off, and the way that she leaps off her back onto her feet, and it's like animal like, and you're like, oh, it's this kind of zombie movie. These zombies are aggressive. She locks the door, but the guy. So when she's on the phone calling 911, and you see the guy stand up behind her, and he's moving kind of awkward. So when she gets out of the house, and you see from her perspective the world just going fucking to shit, and the guy has a gun on her, and the ambulance comes and fucking wrecks him, and it's like it is a thrill ride because it just doesn't stop. Like she gets, you know, she drives, she gets stuck behind a bus, and they're fucking ripping her.
It goes from 0 to 100 in about 5 seconds,
and it lasts. I mean, it's a good. It just keeps going. I mean, and then the cameras zone out, and there's just little stories everywhere, like people chasing, eating somebody over there,
shit exploding.
And when her husband was chasing her, like just fucking sprinting, and then he looks over and sees somebody in the yard, and he just breaks his sprint.
He just curves off.
He just curves off and starts tackling her. You're like, Jesus Christ. All that's to say is like I really enjoyed seeing the transition of into the apocalypse through the little girl's eyes. And
well, and I think it's well staged, and this was done in the game too. So this is both the game and the show do this very well.
Oh, this happened? Yeah, where the old lady changed behind her and all that.
Well, a version of that, a thing like that happens, but we're with a neighbor who has changed and them not understanding what's going on. But the thing that they do very well is the confusion, because the characters don't know what's going on. They just know something terrible is happening, right? And that confusion that comes from like, what the fuck, right? So I mean, I've been in circumstances where you go from I'm in a nice, normal, safe moment of my life, and then suddenly something dramatically dangerous happens. And I'm a person who's pretty quick on my feet, like thinking, like I react very quickly to stuff in general. But there is a moment of confusion because it's so not what your brain is like. Your brain is always kind of thinking of what the next things that are going to happen are. It's already thinking of that. It's like, it's always doing that. And so when something so wildly out of place happens, your brain has a moment of like, what? And like it forces you to kind of like back up and start over again. And I've had that happen where like I was in a moment and then something really out of place happens, and there's that moment of like, what the fuck? And so when I see that happening to characters in situations like this, it feels very real to me.
Yeah.
Where like the dad is like, get in the truck, we gotta go. And she's like, what's going on? He doesn't know. He's just like, some shit is going down. He's with his brother. They're just, and they have that instinct, just get as far away from other people as possible.
Yeah.
Which is,
but their energy coming into it was like, the mystery of what happened to them on the road. Yeah. They're bringing that with them.
Yeah.
So
the brother already has a gun. He's ready.
And he comes like, he's like, get in the car, get in the fucking car. And you're like, what did they just go through? Like, what did they go through to get here? And he comes out and he's covering with the gun. And he's like, what do we do, man? What do we do?
Yeah.
And you're like, Jesus Christ. And because you're with her. So you're experiencing this thing with her. And that's so interesting. And the thing is, like, The Walking Dead, I felt like in some ways kicked the zombie horse to double dead, right? Like, it's like and so you've explored something for 20 seasons. And so I was like, how are they going to, but there was a lot in this that felt fresh.
Yeah.
Even when he's holding his little girl and that zombie's chasing him.
Yeah.
Like there was something fresh about, first of all, I'm terrified of these mushroom cordyceps things. And the fact that they come out of your mouth, like they do that in ants, like they come out of your mouth and they feed on the things. That was fucking gross and scary. And the scene where he's running with his little girl and he's like, look at me. Don't look anywhere else. Look at me. And the zombie is on his ass. And that zombie is like, it's not the slow zombie. It's like, like fucking bouncing off walls and shit. Yep. Are they like that in the game? Are they fast like that in the game?
Well, no. Okay. So here's the thing. And I don't want to get into spoilers because I think you're really going to enjoy the revelations that will come later. So when the ant gets infected by cordyceps, there's a progression to that at first you can't tell from the outside that it's infected. It's just got the fungus inside of it, but you can't see that. It's infecting its brain and starting to take over, but there's no visible thing. And then slowly you begin to see visible external signs of that include like the skull cracking open and the fungus coming out. That there is going to be that progression with the people who are infected, and it's fucking horrifying. So there's different levels of infection. So you say, are they like that in the game? Some, yes. Some, no. But the ones that aren't like that are horrifying in their own way. There's some pretty horrifying shit that comes out. Yeah.
But how sophisticated, we can't control somebody's brain like that. Like how sophisticated are these cordyceps where they can control an ant's brain? Like how are they doing that? You know, I mean that
your brain is all just chemicals. And so obviously these things have evolved to pump the right chemical into the ant's brain to make it behave the way that propagates, because everything is like everything in nature is everything in nature is about how do I make the most number of babies and have them survive, right? Everything is in nature is that. Yeah. And this fungus has co-evolved with the ants so that it pumps the right chemicals into the ant's brain so that the ant does the thing that makes the most fungus babies. Yeah, I mean, it's nature, man. Nature is fucking terrifying.
It is terrifying, but it's like to evolve to the point where you're pumping in the right chemicals to control 8 legs and the body to make it do what you want to do. That's something that if we tried to model, I don't think so. I don't think we could do that. Like if we took, if we tried to model that experiment.
I think we could. I think if that was a thing we were trying to do, that's a thing that we probably could do. The reason that designs so often mimic things in nature, like the shape of submarines or the shape of airplanes or that kind of stuff, we so often wind up mimicking things that already exist in nature, is we've got years or say decades to design something. Evolution has millions or billions of years to design that thing. And when we design something and it doesn't work, we just go back to the drawing board. When something changes in nature and it doesn't work, it just dies. Every single member of that species just dies. So the stakes are so high. Yeah. And there's so many, and nature tries it over and over and over again. You wind up with some pretty amazing stuff that comes out of that process.
Yeah, that is true. Like mimicking the world around you, and then like even mimicking bubbles for deep submarines. Like that's what, John Cameron, like they built their submarine James Cameron, they built their submarine off of the design of a bubble, right? To be able to withstand that tension.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is what I think is kind of fresh. I only watched The Walking Dead for like 2 or 3 seasons, but the zombies were the obstacle in the beginning, and then it kind of went into the apocalyptic world and then people, and they kind of had all that stuff. But this one kind of like it jumps ahead, right? It's like it jumps in 20 years later.
Yeah.
And not only is there this fungi zombie virus that's out there that's like, turning people, but you now have a military dictatorship that is like trying to control and run everything. You got this group called the Fireflies. And obviously the Fireflies are in the game, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And what is their mission exactly?
So they are the ones who are trying to end the military dictatorship. That there are certain elements of society that have used this apocalypse to gain control over everybody, right? And they're the ones who are like, look, we can protect ourselves from this, and we can have a society, and it doesn't have to be a military dictatorship. So they're kind of a rebellion terrorist group.
And their goal is they want a different system.
Yeah, they want a different system, a non-military dictatorship system for surviving the apocalypse. And that's sort of happening concurrent with the story of Joel and Ellie and the this apocalyptic world that they're living in. So those are kind of, those elements all kind of mixed together. But the thing that I find interesting about, so David Benioff, who was one of the two writers who wrote Game of Thrones, the original one, he wrote a book called City of Thieves. Have you ever read that?
You told me about that.
So
really
City of Thieves,
that.
and the writers of Last of Us credit City of Thieves in the game. They talk about, like, not in the game, but in the interviews they've done, they talk about the things that sort of influenced them as they were designing Last of Us. And one of the books they mentioned is City of Thieves. So I actually knew David Benioff at the time. So I was like, hey, have you ever played Last of Us? They talk about your book. They talk about how they were influenced by your book, and he hadn't. He was not a gamer. But the thing with City of Thieves is it's about Stalingrad during the worst of the Nazi invasion of Russia, and how there was a war going on between the Soviet army and the German army in Stalingrad, and there were still people who lived there. Right? There were still people who just lived in Stalingrad. One of my favorite versions of that is the movie Enemy at the Gates.
Yeah, Enemy at the Gates. Yeah.
Where, like, you go out and you fight a battle with some Nazis, and then you go to some lady's house and she cooks you soup.
Yeah.
And she just lives there. She's living in the middle of a war zone. And so City of Thieves is about how regular people, not soldiers, survived in Stalingrad during the worst of that invasion. How everybody turns into a thief because that's the only way to survive. So you're constantly stealing from each other and from the armies and from everything to try to just get enough to survive during this battle, right? Because obviously every mechanism of social order has broken down. They're not making deliveries to grocery stores in the middle of a Nazi invasion, right?
Is this fiction?
It's fiction based on real stuff. Yeah.
And did he write this before, like, the Game of Thrones?
I think he published it. I think he did publish it before the first season of Game of Thrones. I think that's right. The point of this is that Joel's story after the 20 years later jump is where you really see the influence of City of Thieves, because the city that he's living in after that time jump is Stalingrad. It's the city that is currently at war with an invading force,
right?
And an occupying army that's trying to defend it, and all of the social orders have broken down. Like there's not like trucks full of grocery store supplies showing up at that city, right? So where do you get the stuff that you need to live? And so there's this thriving underground of just black markets and thieves and all of that stuff, and Joel's involved in that part of that world, which I find very real and very interesting. I really liked that part of
I did too.
The world.
I really liked that.
And now, his partner, played by Anna Torv, that character was one of my favorite early characters in the game. So I was really happy with the way Anna Torv played that character in the show. I think she's doing a great job with that character. She's a great character in the game. I assume she's going to be a great character on the show too. But that sort of tough survivor who is living in the middle of an apocalypse, but finding a way to scrape by just being tougher than everybody around you. Yeah, that all of that stuff is really well done in both the game and the show. I'm really excited.
Yeah. Now, the prologue takes place in the game at 2013, and in the show it takes place in 2003. Do you know why they did that?
I don't know why they did that.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's what's funny is like it's a period piece and it's an alternate history, but you go back and you look and you're like, it doesn't seem that long ago when George Bush was president, but you're like, when you really think about it, you're like, dude, that was a long ass time ago. That was a long ass time ago.
Yep.
And so then when you see that Nokia phone and you see that thing come out and you're like, Jesus Christ, like how much time has passed,
Yeah.
And but I love that shit. I love that alternate universe and in time period. And I loved the 1968, like the retro thing, because what really kind of freaks me out is like when there are threats that have always been there and that are realistic and that we've always known them. And so when they happen, it's not like a flying saucer comes to Earth and this thing that we totally respect. It's like this thing was always here and they warned us about it, and a long time ago.
Well, and that is the terrifying thing about pandemics, which obviously what's happening in Last of Us is a version of a pandemic. There are so many diseases that we are aware of. I mean, we knew about COVID, or at least that family of diseases, before we had the COVID pandemic. That family of diseases has been around in a lot of other versions, and we've known about them, and we've had brief scares, like bird flu and all that kind of stuff. So we know about these things, and we know that airborne viruses are very dangerous, and especially airborne viruses with high fatality rates, that kind of stuff, very dangerous. But like they will have a little scare and 20 or 30 people will die, and then it doesn't happen, and we go, oh, okay, well, it's not a big deal, and then we forget about it. The idea that one of these things, instead of like, COVID had like a 1% fatality rate. Let's say like, if that was even 10%, like another novel coronavirus comes out, and instead of a 1% fatality rate, it's got a 10% fatality rate. The devastation that would cause on us as a species. But it's happened before. I mean, the Spanish flu killed, more people than the war that preceded it had killed. It's happened before, and we forget. Like it's like we're aware that the Spanish flu happened, but we just kind of forget about it.
Have you ever read about books about the plague in Europe?
Oh yeah.
I mean, to think about half of Europe's population just gone,
just dead.
Yep. And it's hard to wrap your head around like what was going on in their mindsets and everything back then, especially like with like steeped in that kind of, old school religion, Christian mythology of like, oh, for sure this is the end of the fucking world.
Oh
like,
yeah.
There's no other explanation for it. But to lose half of the population just blows my mind. I mean, there's so many people that, the whole power structure fell apart, right? Because now everybody can own land. Like you can own as much fucking land as you want because it's like everything.
Because everybody else is dead.
Yeah, because everybody's fucking dead, Yeah. And those kind of things scared the shit out of me,
Yeah. And that's the thing that the world that Last of Us is playing in is a thing that absolutely can happens.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're in that world, right?
Yeah.
It's the bubonic plague. It's
right.
it's Ebola. It's all these things that we know can happen.
Yeah.
And we just kind of cross our fingers and hope they don't.
Yeah.
It happens. And now we're in a world where most of the population is dead and people are living in walled cities, and it's fucking terrifying.
Yeah. Whenever you have a love story at the center of these terrifying things, like I think like if there's a love story in any horrific horror situation or movie, it always brings me in because you see that like that opening scene, like when you come to really love their relationship between father and daughter and you really care about her, and when the zombie's chasing her and he's like, just look at me, it's so, you're so involved. You're involved with them and you're like, geez, the terror that he wouldn't be feeling. Because if he was by himself, it cut that tension in half.
Oh, yeah.
Like if I was by myself. Or
even if it was just him and his brother.
Or even if it was just him and his brother.
Yeah.
Like me and my brother would be trying to trip each other to get us time. I can take him out. But I feel like whenever there's something like that, it just pulls me in so much more because if I'm by myself nothing really, like, it's not a big deal. But when I have my kids with me, I'm so much more heightened, so much more aware. And the fact that, she died, and I was listening to this interview with Craig Mazin, and he talks about, like, that love is a beautiful thing, but it also can be a horrible thing, because when you love somebody, it can be primal. It could be intense violence that comes from that love. So when his daughter is murdered, that unresolved trauma is going to be passed on to this new relationship. It can't not. And so now you see where his mindset is. Like if The Last of Us started in the 20 years when he's in the town, and you see that, as an actor, he would do that work. That work is now, he would do that prologue to get him to that place emotionally, to then have his resistance to the girl when he first meets her. He's not going to want to feel anything for her. He's not going to be emotionally involved. And then when he does, it's going to be uncontrollable. Like his desire to protect her and the need to protect her. By the way, Bella Ramsey, I really enjoyed her. I think she is a really talented.
I mean,
actress.
if there's a reason why she was everybody's favorite character on Game of Thrones when she came on, she's a really good actor. There's no doubt about that. But there is a force to her. There is like this
strength,
this angry belligerence that just sort of boils under the surface of every scene that she's in Game of Thrones. So when they announced that she was going to play Ellie, I was like, that's a great choice. Yeah. Because Ellie, the character in the game, she's very vulnerable, but she hides that vulnerability with this angry belligerence. And I'm like, yeah, that kid from Game of Thrones is going to be able to pull that off. She's going to be able to pull off that anger that is the armor she wears around her vulnerability. And in the first episode, absolutely nails it. Yeah. She's great. And Pedro Pascal, can we talk about how great that guy is? Because I remember when he came on Game of Thrones as the Red Viper, I don't think a lot of people, like, he'd been around before, but I don't think a lot of people knew him that well before that part. And he absolutely...
nobody knew him. That was his first...
absolutely exploded after that part.
Yeah.
Absolutely exploded.
And he did Narcos and things like that.
Yeah, he did so much stuff and has been great in everything that he's done. I actually, he was at a party that there was a premiere party in Santa Fe for one of the seasons of Game of Thrones. I forget which one. And a few other people who worked on the show came out, and Pedro was one of the people who came out. And my sister happened to be in town, so I took her to that party. And she's a big Game of Thrones fan, big George R.R. Martin fan. And so she and I went and talked to Pedro. What a nice guy. Have you met him? Have you ever worked with him?
I haven't met him. No.
Yeah. What a lovely guy. Like I was like, man, like not only are you incredibly talented and you're great in this part, but you're just a fucking nice guy. Yeah. Like he was super nice to my sister and very like, you know how like sometimes you meet an actor and they put on the nice face and then try to get out of the conversation as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
He was like just being himself and then wound up standing there and chatting with my sister for like half an hour. And never seemed like he was trying to get away. Never seemed like he was like trying to get to the next person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
just great guy.
Listen, I mean, think like Ty, you don't get to, I mean, you've been around long enough to like have a bullshit detector. You know, when somebody's like, so, but that translates to him on screen. That's his presence. There's a gentleness and a kindness, but a strength and a toughness. Like that combination is really attractive to see on screen.
Yeah.
And I remember him on Game of Thrones, Narcos, and I've always was drawn to him. Always thought he was an interesting actor, and he has a presence that always pulls me in. Talk about, I think this is perfect casting for him.
I think it is too.
And I think, this is like, finally, this is going to kind of launch him into the mainstream era because this is a fucking hit.
I think he's already been launched into me. I mean, he obviously played the Mandalorian, which is a big hit for Disney.
Mandalorian, but this is like launch,
I think this is going to get mainstream recognition the way that HBO shows often do. And I think it's going to be huge for him. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I think he'll get shots at like, starring in big studio movies after this. So, I've always been a fan of his and I'm thankful for, I'm I'm happy for him, and he's fantastic in it. But he, what's funny is it's kind of like that lone wolf cub story, like The Road, like Cormac McCarthy, The Road, or whatever. I love these stories. Mandalorian is like the lone wolf cub.
I would say that The Mandalorian is much more lone wolf and cub than Last of Us is, and you'll see as you go through the show, you'll see that Ellie is not a helpless. She's not helpless. The difference between sort of The Mandalorian and Lone Wolf and Cub and other stories like that have the older protector and the younger ward in these dangerous circumstances is Ellie is a surprising character in her own right. And one of my favorite segments in the game, and I obviously I don't want to do spoilers for the show, so I'm not going to get too into it, but there is a sequence in the game where you have to play as Ellie. And it's one of my favorite sequences in the game. And she's a fucking badass in her own right. So I'm very excited to see that part of the story play out, where you get to see that Ellie is not just luggage. She is not just a thing that he carries from place to place. She's got her own agenda.
Well, and you get that sense from her in the, like, I love her little feisty attitude in the beginning. She's like, get me out of these fucking cuffs. And and she's like, gives her a knife and she stabs the dude in the leg. So, but obviously she's special somehow, right? Yeah. She tested positive for the infection. And she's like, but it's not affecting me. Yep. I've been positive for however many days. So maybe there's some kind of connection to a cure through her or something like that. And I love those like chosen one kind of stories, and where it's like, you're more important than us. And how great was that scene where she's like, you don't have a fucking ear on your head, when she's like, during the shootout, and when they had to take them or whatever. But so I really enjoyed it. Did you enjoy? Like, did it live up to your expectations? Being a fan of the game, watching the pilot,
I expected it to be good because, as I said, I'm a huge fan of the writing and directing talent that they've got working on the show. Craig Mazin is a fantastic writer. As I said, Chernobyl is one of my favorite things that's ever been on HBO. So I was already had high expectations. And then as I watched the show, everything felt right. Like I felt like I was falling into this world that I had been in before. When you're a kid and you read a book and it's like your favorite book ever, and then as an adult you reread it and it's just as good as you remember it being when you were a kid, it felt like that. I was like, this feels just as good as it did the first time.
Yeah. Craig Mazin directed it too.
Yeah.
Good for him. Thank you guys for hanging out. I hope you enjoyed us talking about Last of Us. Hopefully you guys are watching it too. I enjoyed it. Did you enjoy it, Ty?
No, I hated it. It was terrible. Worst thing I've ever seen.
No, the conversation.
That's what I'm talking about. The show was great. This conversation is the worst thing I've ever been part of.
Per usual. Say goodbye, Ty.
Goodbye, Ty.